The morning mist hung low over the palace grounds as James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what would prove to be the most consequential day of his 15-year career as a royal protection officer. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the distant sound of preparations for the state funeral that would take place in just 2 hours. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every protocol memorized, every contingency accounted for. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the decision he would soon be forced to make. James had served under 3 different monarchs, witnessed the rise and fall of governments, and protected members of the royal family through scandals, celebrations, and countless public appearances. He had always prided himself on his unwavering adherence to protocol, his ability to blend into the background while maintaining constant vigilance, and his absolute loyalty to the crown. These qualities had earned him a position among the most trusted guards, those selected for the most sensitive assignments, and given access to information that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. The palace corridors buzzed with controlled chaos as staff members made final preparations for what the media had already dubbed the funeral of the century. Foreign dignitaries, heads of state, and members of royal families from across the globe had descended upon London to pay their respects to Queen Elizabeth, whose passing had sent shockwaves through the Commonwealth and beyond. The weight of history pressed down upon every soul within the palace walls, but none felt it more acutely than those charged with ensuring the safety of the new king and his family during this most vulnerable of times. William Arthur Philip Lewis, now second in line to the throne, moved through the palace with the practiced grace of someone born to this life, yet James could see the strain beneath the composed exterior. The young prince had always been different from his brother Harry, more serious, more conscious of his destiny, more willing to shoulder the burdens that came with his birthright. But today, something else flickered in his eyes, a tension that went beyond grief, beyond the natural anxiety of such a momentous occasion. As James took his position outside the prince's private chambers, he reflected on the conversation he had overheard 3 days earlier. It had been late in the evening when he was conducting his routine security sweep of the family quarters. The voices had carried through the heavy oak door of Queen Elizabeth's study, where she had been meeting with her closest advisors and family members in what everyone assumed were final arrangements for her funeral and the transition of power. The boy must be protected at all costs. The Queen's voice had been firm despite her obvious frailty. There are forces at work that go far beyond what the public knows. James, I'm trusting you with something that could change everything. If the moment comes, and you'll know when it does, you must act without hesitation. Protocol be damned. Those words had haunted James for 3 days. Queen Elizabeth had always been a stickler for tradition and protocol. Yet here she was, instructing him to abandon everything he had been trained to hold sacred. The weight of her trust, combined with the cryptic nature of her instructions, had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about his role and responsibilities. The funeral preparations had revealed fractures within the royal family that the public could never have imagined. Behind closed doors, heated discussions had raged about everything from the order of succession to the handling of certain sensitive documents that had come to light following the Queen's death. William had found himself caught in the middle of these disputes, his position as future heir making him a target for various factions seeking to influence the direction of the monarchy. James had noticed the subtle changes in security protocols over the past week. Certain guards had been reassigned, new faces had appeared among the staff, and there had been an increase in encrypted communications between various government agencies. Something was building toward a crescendo, and the funeral provided the perfect cover for whatever forces were maneuvering behind the scenes. The sound of approaching footsteps broke James from his reverie. Charles, now King Charles III, emerged from his private study with a grim expression that immediately put James on high alert. The new monarch's face bore the marks of sleepless nights and difficult decisions, but there was something else, a hardness that hadn't been there before. A resolve that suggested he was prepared to make choices that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. "James!" The king's voice was measured but carried an underlying tension. "I need to speak with William privately. Ensure we are not disturbed for the next hour, regardless of who might request an audience." As the king disappeared into his son's chambers, James positioned himself strategically in the corridor. his hand instinctively moving to the small device Queen Elizabeth had given him just days before her death. She had called it insurance and told him it contained information that could protect the future of the monarchy from those who would see it destroyed. The device felt heavier than its physical weight would suggest, burdened as it was with the trust of a dying queen and the potential to alter the course of history. The conversation behind the heavy doors grew heated, though the exact words remained indistinguishable. James could hear the rise and fall of voices, the sharp tones that indicated disagreement, and at one point, what sounded like William raising his voice in protest. Whatever was being discussed, it was clear that father and son were not in agreement. 20 minutes into the conversation, James's earpiece crackled to life with a coded message that made his blood run cold. "Blackbird is in the nest. Repeat, Blackbird is in the nest." It was the code phrase Queen Elizabeth had told him to watch for, the signal that would require him to act on her final instructions. But what those instructions entailed, beyond protecting William at all costs, remained frustratingly unclear. The corridor suddenly filled with the sound of approaching footsteps. Not the measured pace of palace staff going about their duties, but the purposeful stride of individuals with a specific mission. James recognized several faces from various government agencies, men and women whose presence in the family quarters was highly unusual and deeply concerning. Leading the group was Sir Nigel Pembridge, a career civil servant whose loyalty had always been questionable, and whose sudden prominence in palace affairs following the Queen's death had not gone unnoticed by those who knew how to read the signs. As the group approached, James felt the weight of Queen Elizabeth's final trust settling upon his shoulders. Whatever was about to unfold, he had been specifically chosen to stand between these forces and Prince William. The irony was not lost on him that protecting the future king might require him to defy the current one, but the Queen's words echoed in his mind, "Protocol be damned." The conversation behind the doors had fallen silent, and James could only imagine what was being discussed between father and son. Whatever decisions were being made in that room would have profound implications for the monarchy, the Commonwealth, and the delicate balance of power that had maintained stability for generations. But James's focus remained singular: protect William, regardless of the cost. As Sir Nigel and his companions drew closer, their intentions became increasingly clear. This was not a routine security check or a briefing about funeral arrangements. This was something far more serious, something that would test every principle James had sworn to uphold when he first donned the uniform of the Royal Protection Service. The moment Queen Elizabeth had prepared him for was rapidly approaching, and there would be no second chances to get it right. Sir Nigel Pembridge approached with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His reputation within certain circles of government was well established. A master manipulator who had survived multiple administrations by playing all sides against each other while maintaining plausible deniability for his actions. Behind him walked three individuals James didn't immediately recognize, but their bearing and the subtle bulges beneath their jackets marked them as private security rather than official government agents. This informal army worried James far more than any official delegation would have. "Stand aside, Mitchell." Sir Nigel's voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "We have urgent business with the prince. National security matters that cannot wait for the convenience of family meetings." James remained motionless, his training taking over as he assessed the situation. Every instinct told him this was the moment Queen Elizabeth had warned him about, the crisis that would test his loyalty not to the crown as an institution, but to the principles the crown was supposed to represent. The device in his pocket seemed to pulse with significance, though he knew it was merely his imagination giving weight to the Queen's final gift. "I'm sorry, Sir Nigel, but His Royal Highness is in a private meeting with His Majesty the King. My orders are to ensure they are not disturbed." James's voice remained perfectly calm, professional, giving no hint of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Sir Nigel's eyes narrowed, and James caught the subtle hand signal he gave to his companions. These were not the actions of someone conducting legitimate government business. Whatever authority Sir Nigel claimed to possess, it was clear he was prepared to exceed it to achieve his objectives. "This is not a request, Mitchell. Step aside, or you will be removed." The threat was delivered with the casual indifference of someone who had made similar threats before and followed through on them. Behind the heavy oak doors, the voices had risen again, and James could now make out fragments of the conversation. William's voice, strained but determined. "I won't be party to this. Mother made her feelings clear about these arrangements." The king's response was muffled, but carried an edge of frustration that suggested the conversation was not going as he had hoped. James's mind raced through the possibilities. Queen Elizabeth had spoken of forces within the government, within the establishment itself, that sought to fundamentally alter the nature of the monarchy. She had hinted at documents, at secrets that could compromise not just individual reputations but the very legitimacy of the royal succession. Whatever was in those documents, whoever controlled them would wield enormous power over the future direction of the country. The realization struck him like a physical blow. This wasn't about protecting William from external threats. This was about protecting him from elements within his own family, within his own government, who saw him as an obstacle to their plans. The Queen's final act of protection for her grandson was to place a loyal guardian between him and those who would manipulate or control him for their own purposes. "Sir Nigel," James said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I'm going to have to ask you to wait until the meeting concludes. Perhaps you could schedule an appointment through the proper channels." The pretense of civility finally cracked. Sir Nigel gestured sharply to his companions, who immediately began to move forward. "Remove him," he ordered, his voice losing all pretense of diplomatic courtesy. As the three men advanced, James made a decision that would echo through history. Rather than engage in a physical confrontation that would alert everyone in the palace to the crisis unfolding, he stepped away from the door and activated the small device Queen Elizabeth had given him. A soft electronic tone filled the corridor, followed by the distinctive sound of heavy locks engaging throughout the family quarters. Sir Nigel's face darkened as he realized what had happened. The device was more sophisticated than James had imagined. Not merely a recording or communication tool, but an emergency protocol that could effectively seal off sections of the palace from outside interference. Queen Elizabeth had literally given him the keys to the kingdom, at least to this small but crucial part of it. "What have you done?" Sir Nigel's voice rose to nearly a shout, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I've followed the direct orders of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth," James replied, his hand moving to his service weapon. "Orders that supersede any authority you might claim to possess." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the sound of the door opening behind them changed everything. William emerged first, his face pale but resolute, followed by his father, whose expression suggested the conversation had not concluded to his satisfaction. "What's the meaning of this?" King Charles's voice carried the full weight of royal authority, but James noticed something else in his tone. A wariness that suggested he had been expecting this confrontation. Sir Nigel immediately shifted his approach, the consummate politician adapting to new circumstances. "Your Majesty, we have received credible intelligence of a security threat. It is imperative that Prince William be moved to a secure location immediately." William stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from every member of the group. "And what is the nature of this threat, Sir Nigel? Perhaps you could enlighten us all." The question hung in the air like a challenge. James watched the interplay of glances between the king, Sir Nigel, and Prince William, reading the subtext of years of royal politics and personal relationships. Whatever had been discussed in that private meeting, it was clear that father and son remained at odds about how to proceed. "The details are classified, Your Royal Highness," Sir Nigel replied, but his hesitation was telling. "I can only say that your continued presence in the palace poses an unacceptable risk." "How convenient. A classified threat that requires me to abandon my duties on the day we lay my grandmother to rest. Tell me, Sir Nigel, who exactly is threatened by my presence here?" The accusation in William's voice was unmistakable, and James saw Sir Nigel's companions tense in response. Whatever game was being played here, the stakes were far higher than a simple security threat. This was about power, about control, about the very future of the monarchy itself. King Charles stepped forward, his voice carrying a warning. "William, there are matters here that you don't fully understand. Perhaps it would be best if you accompanied Sir Nigel." "No, William's response was immediate and final. "I understand more than you think, Father. I understand what Mother told James. I understand what you're asking me to abandon. And I understand that some things are more important than temporary safety." The revelation that William knew about his grandmother's instructions to James changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Sir Nigel's face went through several expressions before settling on cold calculation. "I see that we have reached an impasse," Sir Nigel said slowly. "Perhaps it's time to clarify exactly what authority each of us possesses in this situation." He reached into his jacket and James's hand immediately moved to his weapon. But instead of a threat, Sir Nigel produced a document bearing official government seals. "A warrant issued under the Civil Contingencies Act," Sir Nigel announced with obvious satisfaction, "granting extraordinary powers in matters of national security. Your Royal Highness, you are now under protective custody pending resolution of the current crisis." James stared at the document, his mind racing through the implications. The Civil Contingencies Act was emergency legislation that could effectively suspend normal legal protections in times of crisis. If the document was genuine, Sir Nigel possessed legal authority that superseded even royal prerogatives, but William seemed unimpressed by the legal maneuvering. "And who determined that a crisis exists, Sir Nigel? Who decided that the Crown Prince represents a threat to national security? Because last I checked, I haven't committed any crimes against the realm." "The nature of the crisis will be explained once you are in a secure location," Sir Nigel replied, but his tone suggested he was growing impatient with the extended negotiations. James found himself at the center of a constitutional crisis that would have profound implications, regardless of how it was resolved. Follow official authority and allow William to be removed, potentially betraying Queen Elizabeth's final trust. Resist and risk being branded a traitor to the legitimate government. There were no good options, only degrees of consequence. The weight of history pressed down upon everyone in the corridor. In a few hours, the world would witness the funeral of one of the longest-reigning monarchs in British history. But here, in this moment, the future of the monarchy itself hung in the balance. The decision James made in the next few seconds would reverberate through generations. The tension in the corridor reached a breaking point as James weighed his options. Queen Elizabeth's words echoed in his mind with increasing clarity, and suddenly, the pieces of her final instructions began to fall into place. She hadn't just given him a device to protect William. She had given him the means to expose whatever conspiracy was unfolding around them. "Sir Nigel," James said quietly, his voice carrying a new authority that made everyone in the corridor take notice. "Before we proceed with these extraordinary measures, perhaps you'd be interested in viewing some extraordinary evidence." He activated a different function on the Queen's device, and suddenly the corridor filled with the sound of recorded conversations. Sir Nigel's voice was immediately recognizable, along with several others discussing the William problem and the need to neutralize his influence before the transition is complete. The color drained from Sir Nigel's face as he realized the implications of what was being played back for everyone to hear. These were conversations that had taken place in supposedly secure government buildings, discussions that revealed a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of the establishment. "Project Crown Reset," Sir Nigel's recorded voice continued, "requires the removal of all obstacles to the modernization agenda. The old guard's resistance must be overcome, and that includes certain members of the royal family who remain attached to outdated notions of constitutional monarchy." William's expression shifted from surprise to grim understanding as the recordings continued to play. His grandmother had not only anticipated this moment, she had carefully documented the evidence needed to expose those who sought to manipulate the monarchy for their own purposes. King Charles stepped backward, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Where did these recordings come from?" he demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Her late Majesty was more aware of the forces arrayed against the crown than anyone realized," James replied, his confidence growing as he understood the full scope of Queen Elizabeth's final strategy. "She spent her last months gathering evidence of activities that threatened the constitutional balance she had sworn to protect." Sir Nigel's companions were becoming increasingly agitated as they realized their mission had been compromised from the beginning. Their leader, however, maintained his composure with the skill of someone accustomed to political survival. Clever, Sir Nigel admitted, his voice taking on a new edge of respect mixed with calculation. But recordings can be fabricated, taken out of context, misinterpreted. Do you really think such evidence would stand up to scrutiny in a court of law? Perhaps not, William interjected, stepping forward to face Sir Nigel directly. But they would certainly create interesting headlines in tomorrow's newspapers. I can't imagine the government would welcome that kind of scrutiny on the day of my grandmother's funeral. The standoff had shifted dramatically. Sir Nigel's position of apparent strength had been undermined by evidence he couldn't have anticipated, while William had gained both moral authority and tactical advantage. But James knew this was far from over. Men like Sir Nigel didn't surrender easily, and the stakes were too high for simple retreat. "You're playing a dangerous game, Your Royal Highness," Sir Nigel warned. "There are forces in motion that go far beyond what you understand. Your grandmother's death was not the end of the old order. It was the beginning of necessary changes. Changes that apparently require the suspension of constitutional government and the elimination of inconvenient royal voices." William shot back. "Tell me, Sir Nigel, who appointed you as the architect of the monarchy's future?" James watched the interplay between the two men and realized this confrontation had been building for far longer than he had initially understood. This wasn't just about immediate political maneuvering. This was the culmination of years of tension between different visions of what the monarchy should become in the modern world. King Charles finally spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of difficult revelations. "William, there are complexities here that you don't fully grasp. The pressures facing the crown, the expectations of modernization, the demands from Parliament and the public sometimes compromise is necessary for survival." "Compromise," William repeated, his voice filled with disappointment. "Is that what you call abandoning the principles that have guided this institution for centuries? Is that what you call surrendering our independence to political manipulators?" The family drama playing out before them added another layer of complexity to James' decision. He was not just protecting William from external threats. He was potentially placing himself between a father and son whose fundamental disagreement about the future of the monarchy had reached a crisis point. Sir Nigel seized on the family tension, recognizing an opportunity to regain initiative. "Your Majesty, perhaps this unfortunate misunderstanding can be resolved without further escalation. Prince William is clearly under significant stress, understandable given the circumstances. A brief retreat from public duties would allow time for cooler heads to prevail." "I'm not going anywhere," William declared, his voice carrying absolute finality. "Today we bury the greatest monarch in British history. Tomorrow we begin the work of ensuring her legacy survives the ambitions of those who would corrupt it. I will not be removed, manipulated, or silenced." James felt the moment crystallizing around him. Queen Elizabeth had prepared him for this exact scenario, the point where protecting William would require defying not just government authority, but potentially royal authority as well. The loyalty she had demanded was not to titles or institutions, but to the principles those institutions were meant to serve. The recorded conversations continued to play in the background, painting an increasingly clear picture of the conspiracy William faced. References to financial incentives, media coordination, and strategic removal of obstacles revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond simple political disagreement. Sir Nigel's patience finally reached its limit. "Enough of this theater," he snapped, gesturing sharply to his companions. "The authority granted under the Civil Contingencies Act is not subject to debate or delay. Prince William will be removed to a secure location by force if necessary." As his companions moved forward, James made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of drawing his weapon, he activated the final function on Queen Elizabeth's device. Suddenly, every communication system in the palace came alive with the broadcast of the recorded conversations, ensuring that everyone from senior staff to security personnel would hear the evidence of the conspiracy against the crown. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Footsteps could be heard throughout the palace as loyal staff members responded to what they were hearing. Sir Nigel's face went ashen as he realized his carefully constructed plan was collapsing around him. "You've just committed treason," Sir Nigel snarled at James. "Defying lawful government authority, interfering with matters of national security, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison." "Perhaps," James replied calmly, but I'll sleep well knowing I kept faith with the greatest sovereign this nation has ever known." William placed a hand on James's shoulder, a gesture of support that spoke volumes about the bond forged in this moment of crisis. "Sometimes," the prince said, his voice carrying new authority and resolve, "protecting the crown means standing against those who would corrupt it." The sound of approaching reinforcements echoed through the corridor, but whether they were coming to support or oppose William remained unclear. The next few minutes would determine not just the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but the very future of the British monarchy itself. The sound of approaching footsteps created a symphony of uncertainty throughout the palace corridors. As the recorded evidence continued to broadcast through every communication channel, the building itself seemed to divide into camps, those loyal to the crown as represented by William, and those aligned with the government forces Sir Nigel represented. Colonel Sarah Hawthorne, head of palace security, was the first senior official to arrive in the corridor. Her face was grim as she approached the group, having clearly heard enough of the recordings to understand the magnitude of the situation unfolding before her. Behind her came a mixed group of security personnel, their expressions ranging from confusion to determination as they tried to process the implications of what they had heard. "Your Royal Highness," Colonel Hawthorne addressed William directly, her military bearing evident in every word. "The palace is currently in a state of controlled chaos. These recordings have created significant concern among the staff, and there are reports of unauthorized personnel attempting to access restricted areas." Sir Nigel stepped forward, attempting to reassert his authority. "Colonel Hawthorne, thank you for your prompt response. As you can see, we have a security situation that requires immediate resolution. Prince William needs to be moved to a secure location while we sort out these unfortunate misunderstandings." Colonel Hawthorne's response was measured but telling. "Sir Nigel, with respect, I answer to the Crown, not to government officials operating under questionable emergency powers. Until I receive direct orders from His Majesty the King, Prince William remains under the protection of palace security." The declaration created a visible shift in the balance of power. Sir Nigel's companions, who had appeared confident in their authority, now looked uncertain as they realized they were outnumbered by personnel whose loyalty was to the royal family rather than to government agencies. King Charles found himself in an impossible position, caught between his son's defiance, the evidence of conspiracy against the crown, and his own complex relationship with the political establishment. His next words would determine whether the crisis escalated or began to resolve. "Colonel Hawthorne," the king said slowly, "I need time to fully understand the implications of what we've heard today. Until further notice, security protocols remain unchanged. No one enters or leaves the family quarters without my explicit authorization." It was a diplomatic solution that avoided choosing sides while maintaining the status quo, but James could see from Sir Nigel's expression that it wasn't going to be enough to diffuse the situation. "Your Majesty," Sir Nigel's voice took on a new urgency, "I must stress that delaying action could have catastrophic consequences. The intelligence we've received suggests imminent threats that require immediate response." William stepped forward, his patience with the elaborate deceptions finally exhausted. "What intelligence, Sir Nigel? The intelligence that suggests I'm a threat to national security? Or the intelligence that says the monarchy needs to be modernized according to your specifications?" The recordings had shifted into a new section, revealing discussions about media manipulation and public opinion campaigns designed to discredit members of the royal family who resisted the modernization agenda. The voices included journalists, political operatives, and even some members of parliament, painting a picture of a comprehensive campaign to reshape the monarchy from within. Colonel Hawthorne's expression darkened as she heard her own name mentioned in connection with plans to replace unreliable security personnel with individuals more amenable to government influence. The personal nature of the conspiracy was becoming clear to everyone present, and the implications were staggering. "These recordings," Colonel Hawthorne said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "suggest a conspiracy that extends far beyond policy disagreements. If authentic, they represent a fundamental attack on the constitutional independence of the crown." Sir Nigel's composure finally cracked completely. "You're all fools if you think the monarchy can survive in its current form," he snarled. "The public demands accountability, transparency, Relevance. These romantic notions of royal independence are relics of a bygone era. And you've appointed yourself as the arbiter of what the public demands? William's voice carried a dangerous edge. Tell me, Sir Nigel, when did the British people vote to place you in charge of reforming their constitutional system? The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of additional personnel, including several members of the royal household staff, whose faces reflected the shock of what they had been hearing. Among them was Margaret Thornley, the Queen's former private secretary, whose presence immediately commanded attention from everyone in the corridor. Your Royal Highness. Thornley addressed William with the dignity that had made her one of Queen Elizabeth's most trusted advisers. Her late Majesty asked me to deliver this to you personally in the event that certain circumstances arose. She handed William a sealed envelope bearing the royal seal, its weight seemingly disproportionate to its size. As William opened it, James noticed that even King Charles leaned forward with interest, suggesting that even he was not fully aware of all his mother's final preparations. William read the document quickly, his expression shifting through several emotions before settling on something approaching relief, mixed with determination. When he looked up, his bearing had changed fundamentally. He no longer appeared to be a young man caught in circumstances beyond his control, but a future king who had found his footing. This document, William announced, his voice carrying new authority, is a formal directive from Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth, witnessed and notarized according to proper legal procedures. It specifically addresses the protection of the Crown's independence from political manipulation and authorizes extraordinary measures to preserve constitutional balance. Sir Nigel's face went pale as he realized the implications. Queen Elizabeth had not just gathered evidence of the conspiracy against the Crown, she had created legal mechanisms to counter it. The document in William's hands potentially gave him authority that superseded even the emergency powers Sir Nigel claimed to possess. Furthermore, William continued, this directive specifically names James Mitchell as a trusted agent of the Crown, authorized to take any actions necessary to preserve the integrity of the monarchy against internal and external threats. The revelation transformed James's status from potential traitor to legitimate agent of royal authority. His decision to break protocol in defense of William was now officially sanctioned by the previous sovereign's final instructions. King Charles stepped forward, his expression troubled. William, I must see that document. The implications of what you're describing could create a constitutional crisis that makes our current difficulties seem minor by comparison. Father, William replied, his voice softening slightly, the constitutional crisis already exists. The question is whether we're going to allow it to destroy everything grandmother built, or whether we're going to fight to preserve the principles she devoted her life to defending. The standoff had evolved into something far more complex than a simple security incident. This was now a fundamental test of whether the British constitutional system could survive an orchestrated attempt to subordinate the Crown to political control. Sir Nigel and his companions found themselves increasingly isolated as the balance of support in the corridor shifted decisively toward William. The recordings continued to play, revealing additional layers of the conspiracy, and making it clear that the threat to the monarchy was both broader and more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. The next few hours would determine whether Queen Elizabeth's final gambit had been sufficient to protect the institution she had served for more than 7 decades, or whether the forces of change would prove too powerful to resist. The palace bells began their solemn toll, marking the beginning of the formal ceremonies that would lay Queen Elizabeth to rest. The sound echoed through corridors that had witnessed one of the most dramatic constitutional crises in British history, a crisis that was now reaching its resolution through the dead Queen's extraordinary foresight and planning. William stood in the center of the corridor, Queen Elizabeth's final directive still in his hands, as he watched Sir Nigel's carefully constructed conspiracy crumble around him. The recordings had revealed not just the scope of the plot against the Crown, but also the identities of co-conspirators throughout the government and media establishments. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, and utterly authentic. Colonel Hawthorne had taken charge of securing Sir Nigel and his companions, their authority under the Civil Contingencies Act, effectively nullified by the Queen's superior legal preparations. The emergency powers they had claimed to possess were revealed to be based on fabricated intelligence reports and manipulated security assessments. the very kind of governmental overreach Queen Elizabeth's directive was designed to counter. King Charles examined his mother's final document with growing amazement and, James suspected, some degree of embarrassment at his own role in the day's events. The directive was masterfully crafted, anticipating multiple scenarios and providing legal frameworks for protecting the Crown's independence under various circumstances. It was the work of someone who had spent decades understanding the delicate balance of British constitutional government and who was determined to preserve it for future generations. "She knew," the king said finally, his voice filled with wonder and regret. "She knew exactly what they were planning, and she prepared for every contingency." Even from her deathbed, she was protecting the monarchy from those who would corrupt it. William nodded, his respect for his grandmother's wisdom and foresight clearly evident. She also knew that preserving the crown sometimes requires standing against those who claim to represent its interests. That's why she entrusted James with such extraordinary authority. James felt the weight of history settling upon him as he realized his actions would be studied and debated for generations to come. The guard who broke protocol to save the monarchy would become either a heroic figure in the annals of royal protection or a cautionary tale about the dangers of individual initiative. At this moment, however, he knew he had made the right choice. "Mrs. Bick." Thornley stepped forward, producing additional documents from her briefcase. Her late Majesty also prepared comprehensive evidence packages for delivery to the Prime Minister, the Speaker of the House of Commons, and the heads of the major media organizations. The conspiracy against the Crown will be exposed in full, and those responsible will face appropriate consequences. The implications were staggering. Sir Nigel's network had included members of Parliament, senior civil servants, media executives, and even some members of the judiciary. Queen Elizabeth's evidence would trigger the most significant political scandal in modern British history, reshaping the relationship between the Crown, Parliament, and the civil service for decades to come. Sir Nigel, now effectively under arrest, made one final attempt to salvage his position. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he warned. "The forces behind this modernization effort won't simply disappear because of your grandmother's paranoid preparations. This is bigger than any single conspiracy." William's response was measured but firm. "You're absolutely right, Sir Nigel. The threats to constitutional government are ongoing, which is why we need institutions strong enough and independent enough to resist them. That's what my grandmother understood, and that's what she died protecting." As the palace staff worked to restore normal operations while simultaneously implementing enhanced security protocols based on Queen Elizabeth's directives, James reflected on the extraordinary events of the morning. In a matter of hours, he had gone from a loyal but unremarkable protection officer to a key figure in preserving the constitutional balance of the United Kingdom. The funeral preparations continued with renewed purpose and meaning. What had begun as a ceremony to honor a beloved monarch had become a celebration of the principles she had died defending. The attempted coup against the crown had failed not because of military intervention or political maneuvering, but because of one woman's determination to protect the institution she had served her entire life. Colonel Hawthorne coordinated with law enforcement agencies to begin the complex process of investigating and prosecuting the conspiracy Sir Nigel had led. The evidence was overwhelming, but the political implications would reverberate for months as the full scope of the plot became public knowledge. King Charles approached William, extending his hand in a gesture that carried enormous symbolic weight. "Your grandmother chose her protector well," he said, glancing toward James, "and she raised a son who understood when breaking protocol was the highest form of loyalty." The reconciliation between father and son was still fragile, complicated by the morning's revelations about the king's own involvement in discussions with Sir Nigel's faction. But the crisis had clarified the fundamental principles at stake and created an opportunity for rebuilding the relationship on a stronger foundation. As the morning progressed and the formal funeral ceremonies began, word of the morning's events spread throughout the international community. Foreign dignitaries who had come to pay their respects to Queen Elizabeth found themselves witnesses to a dramatic demonstration of the enduring strength of British constitutional government. James resumed his position as William's protection officer, but his role had been fundamentally transformed. He was no longer simply a guard following orders. He had become a symbol of the personal loyalty and institutional integrity that Queen Elizabeth had spent her reign building and protecting. The attempted coup had failed, but its revelation served a crucial purpose in strengthening the defenses of constitutional government against future attacks. Queen Elizabeth's final gift to her country was not just the exposure of one conspiracy, but the creation of mechanisms and precedents that would help protect the crown's independence for generations to come. As the funeral procession began and millions around the world prepared to say farewell to one of history's greatest monarchs, those who knew the full story of the morning's events understood they were witnessing something even more significant than the end of an era. They were watching the successful defense of principles and institutions that had taken centuries to build and could have been destroyed in a single morning without Queen Elizabeth's extraordinary preparation and foresight. The guard had broken protocol to save the crown, but in doing so, he had followed the highest protocol of all, the duty to protect not just individuals, but the principles and institutions that make constitutional government possible. Queen Elizabeth's final victory was complete, and her legacy was secure in the hands of those who understood what she had fought to preserve.